From the Oklahoman newsroom, it's another Football Friday OSU edition. I'm here with part of our OSU coverage team, columnist Barry Trammell and OSU beat writer Kyle Fredrickson. And guys, the Alamo Bowl is getting closer and closer, hard to believe. December 29th, so we're about 10 days out, a little less than 10 days out. Cowboys will be down in San Antonio, and lo and behold, Kyle, it's a homecoming for several Cowboys, which frankly, you couldn't say all that many years ago. They really didn't have that many San Antonio guys. Now, guys like Vincent Taylor, Trey Flowers, Jordan Stearns. I mean, the list is fairly extensive here with the number of San Antonio guys they've got.
Yeah, when Glenn Spencer was hired onto this defensive coaching staff in about 2008, he was sort of handed the reins to this recruiting ground. Here's San Antonio. Good luck is basically what the coaching staff told him, just because historically the DFW areas, the Houston areas, those were more of the hotbed for the Cowboys and finding that talent. But the guys that you mentioned really have made a huge impact for the Cowboys. At least 6 players on the roster right now who we spoke with on Thursday in preparation for this game are either starters or are very big contributors for this team, especially on defense. And that kind of lends itself to Spencer being in charge of that recruiting ground. So, you know, I think as the metroplexes across the state of Texas become just infiltrated with coaches from across the country, OSU's had to get a little bit creative in the ways that it finds different talent, and going in a place like San Antonio has been a good place to start.
You know, I have to admit, Barry, as Mike Gundy, Glenn Spencer, they were all talking about recruiting the San Antonio area, I was a little surprised to hear that that wasn't really a place that too many coaches went, or they didn't feel like it was. And I think Glenn Spencer sort of backed that up and said, you know, they just kind of threw him a bone. They didn't think much meat was on and said, go try to find somebody there. You know, I figured these coaches would find players anywhere. And to hear that a large metroplex in Texas went largely unrecruited, or, you know, you didn't sort of see an influx, that was a little surprising to me.
It was to me, although anybody that, you know, I don't really follow recruiting currently, but I remember back in the old days, San Antonio was not a hotbed. I mean, San Antonio and frankly Austin, little less so, but Dallas and Houston were the big dogs, still are. But San Antonio was not a huge place where good teams or necessarily great players came out of. In recent years, we've seen a change in that. Converse Judson, I think, was the first in the San Antonio area. But what we've seen is the idea that Texas high school football is just great everywhere is not necessarily so.
Yeah.
And it in the same way that, you know, the football in Louisiana or Oklahoma or Arkansas, wherever, you know, sort of followed behind Texas, same is true of certain pockets of Texas. So I think the football in San Antonio area has gotten a lot better in the last decade, maybe the last 15 years. So that's why I think you're seeing more players there. The programs are getting better, the player development's getting better, the coaching's getting better, and now you're seeing the recruiting go up also.
Well, you know, and I asked a couple of these San Antonio guys who are on the team, Kyle, you know, what they thought changed in San Antonio, and, you know, a couple different answers. Malcolm Brown, the former Texas running back who was at the time the #1 running back in the country, came out of the San Antonio area. They thought maybe he sort of turned the corner. But then you look at a program like Steele, which I think was mentioned, you know, that's where Jordan Stearns went. That's where his younger brother, now a high-level cornerback recruit who's committed to LSU, is going. They won a state championship, are playing for another one. Maybe the rise of those programs to those state champion levels in Texas was the answer. Have you gotten a sense, as you sort of looked at things, what did change in San Antonio, or did the football just get better?
I think, like Barry said, the football just got better, but we got to remember, across the state of Texas, I mean, it's an arms race in terms of the funding that these schools are using for not just stadiums, but inside indoor facilities for practice. So from top to bottom, you know, it's still such a huge deal in all parts of the state. And like you mentioned, just this weekend we're going to get a DeSoto versus Steele state title game in the 6A game there with some alums from both of those schools on OSU's roster.
Right.
Definitely some rooting interest there. But for OSU, I think, you know, with the way that kids these days are able to market themselves with Twitter, the internet, with their huddle tapes, I don't know that it matters really where you are. If you can play football and if you've got the highlights to show it, I think coaches are going to find you.
Yeah, and OSU, with getting in there, you know, maybe 6 to 8 years ago, they may be one of those schools that sort of has some hooks in San Antonio. We've seen them continue to get guys, and it's going to be interesting to see how that continues when you start to see the LSUs, the Alabamas, some of those programs get in there. As I mentioned, one of those guys that came out of San Antonio, Vincent Taylor, going back home, he's a guy that, Kyle, we found out during Mike Gundy's pre-bowl press conference, had gotten or requested NFL grades. What do we know at this point about potential early NFL entries for the Cowboys?
Well, at this point, it's more routine than anything as far as this process is concerned. When the regular season's over, the Cowboys take, I think it's up to 5 players who have interest in seeing where they are evaluated at the next level. After they complete some online assessments, a committee of former college coaches and other NFL executives gives one of 3 grades, either a first-round grade, a second-round grade, or neither, which is basically a recommendation to stay in school. And for the Cowboys, Mike Gundy said that was 4 players. You know, they're the guys that we figured were obviously going to be on that list. Mason Rudolph, who's projected as high as a top 10 pick by the Sporting News. James Washington, as you mentioned, Vincent Taylor, and also Chad Whitener. And with Whitener in the mix, it also just shows you, just because you enter for these evaluations doesn't necessarily mean you're going to go. I think for a lot of these guys, they just want to know where they stand in terms of what NFL execs think about them, because I don't think in anyone's mind Whitener is a guy who's going to be a first or second rounder. He'll probably end up just making a practice squad, I would think, barring a really great senior year. But yes, for at this time of the year, you know, it's difficult for these guys, especially the high-profile players, to sort of balance this, you know, decision of playing in the pros and getting ready for the bowl game. We saw it last year with Emmanuel Ogbah, who was pretty defiant with reporters and not wanting to talk about it until the game was over, and then he made his announcement on Twitter. So I would guess that we're going to have to wait for something similar to happen with at least 3 of these guys moving forward, you know, so they can play this bowl game, get those evaluations back, and then make their decision moving forward.
Yeah, to what Mike Gundy said was those grades have not come back yet. He said 10 to 14 days is kind of the norm. They haven't got those back. We didn't hear from Mason Rudolph or James Washington at that midweek, late week availability Thursday, but Vince Taylor was there, and he said he was going to wait till after the bowl game to look. Now, they're playing an earlier bowl game this year, so I think that probably lends maybe to some of that change. But, Barry, I know you always say that you're surprised anytime anybody comes back, but, you know, do you think that the Cowboys are going to be looking for a new quarterback, new top target, new interior defensive anchor? I mean, are these guys likely to go, not likely to go in your mind?
Well, I mean, I think somebody like Mason Rudolph is not likely to go. He had a really good year, but there were a lot of things that he showed that weren't up to pro standards. The Bedlam game being an example where he threw the ball very poorly. That would be a bad, you know, that would be a bad tape that he really doesn't want the scouts to focus on when they make their selections. I think he'd be better off with a full year of putting that one behind him. So somebody like Washington, Vince Taylor, you know, I think they're pro-ready now. I don't know what another year could do in terms of increasing their draft stock significantly. Somewhat, yes. So to me, it's always just a personal decision. Do you want to spend another year in college? Are you enjoying yourself? Are you near your degree? What's your chances of, after you've left campus, to come back and get that degree? You know, the one thing I tell people is, no matter how much money you make, your senior year of college is not for sale. You can't go back and buy it. So if you're enjoying yourself, I think those guys ought to stay. But school's not for everybody. That life's not for everybody. So, you know, a lot of them are ready to get out and get on their own and not have a coach telling them what time to get up in the morning and who to have dinner with the night before a game. They're ready to be adults. And if they are, power to them. I tell everybody, I turned pro right out of high school, so I'm not going to tell James Washington to go to college for a 4th year.
You know, Kyle, Mike Gundy has said this a couple times in reference to these guys making the decision that he's only had one player as a head coach that he felt like was ready to make that early entry, and that was Brandon Pettigrew. And Pettigrew came back for his senior year. Has had a long career in the NFL since, so it worked out pretty well for him. But do you have any sense of what these guys are thinking? You wrote earlier this year, you know, this Rudolph-Washington decision in a lot of ways mirrors what we saw out of Whedon and Blackman a few years back that then became that Fiesta Bowl year, that Big 12 championship year. Do you sense those two potentially playing off of each other? Is Vincent Taylor, you know, an entity in and of himself? What's your sense of those 3 guys?
Yeah, I think with Rudolph and Washington, I think a lot of that is in play, the teamwork there, the fact that, okay, I can play one more year and also come back with this potentially top 10 NFL draft pick or potentially first-round NFL wide receiver pick. I think that's huge for these guys, but this is something that Mike Gundy maybe hasn't referenced this year, but he referenced last year. The difference between being a second-round pick and a first-round pick can be millions and millions of dollars.
Yeah.
So if it's a part of your decision is financial, and if you think you can become, one of those top 15 or top 20 picks, compare that to maybe one of those guys in the mid to late second rounds, that's a big difference in money. And I don't know how much of that's going to play into the decision-making of a Mason Rudolph or a James Washington or a Vincent Taylor, beyond even the teammate aspect of this, because when we look at this OSU team, it would sure, make sense that they would be Big 12 title contenders a year from now, give these guys a platform to really showcase their skills. But if they're thinking about their bank accounts, if you're confident that you could sneak into that top 10, I think staying another year and being a more solid pick would go a long way to kind of calming those nerves of possibly falling out of that group.
As I look at those three guys, James Washington strikes me as the guy that could maybe be inserted onto an NFL roster has the best NFL talent currently. And yet when I think about losing any of those three, I think he's the most easy to fill that hole, which is crazy because that wide receiver group is so deep. But if you're going to lose any of the three, I would think Washington would be the guy you'd want to lose, which seems insane.
Well, you got to have a quarterback.
Yeah.
And the hardest people to find on planet Earth are honest politicians and good defensive tackles. So that's a tough one. You got somebody like Vincent Taylor, you think, this is fantastic. How do we get more of these? And they're hard. So I agree with you, no doubt about it. As good as Washington is, they got another guy. Chris Lacey, just out of the blue, became a deep ball threat this year. So
and they get Marcel Aitman back.
Get Aitman back. So they've got all kinds of options at wide receiver. So that would be the least harmful to the 2017 prospects. But if they lose Rudolph, you're starting over at quarterback. That's tough. Vincent Taylor's a rare athletic marvel there at defensive tackle, so they would really miss those two guys.
And we got to remember at Rudolph, he's a junior, but he only played a couple games his freshman year. So to have a chance to come back and just get more game experience under his belt, I got to think that'd be big for him.
Well, and I would think, too, at that position, he has to think, I get Justice Hill back. This offensive line, while losing a Victor Saleko, a couple pieces here and there, largely brings back the protection for Mason Rudolph is fairly decent. And then that wide receiver group, I would think he would be excited potentially about coming back to play with that bunch. So.
Well, and what we've seen at OSU is every other year they're a Big 12 contender, except this year, Gundy condensed it in 2 straight years, Big 12 contenders. So there's reason for rampant optimism around Oklahoma State football. There's reason to think this program has arrived not as a college football playoff annual contender. I'm not trying to say that, but as one of the elite teams of the Big 12, in fact, one of the 2 elite programs in the Big 12 until Texas gets its stuff straightened out. You got OU 1, OSU 2. The Big 12 has shown that that's what they sort of think is going to happen because of the way they set the schedule and avoid bedlam late season. So there's reason to think that anybody that comes back is going to have a good year on the field. So that's something a lot of schools have always enjoyed. If you're at Oklahoma or USC or Michigan or Ohio State, Alabama, if you decide to come back, it's not like you're risking not in having a successful season team-wise and end up in the Liberty Bowl. Good chance you're going to have a nice year. So Oklahoma State now can offer their guys that very same assurance.
Speaking of bowl games, guys, let's talk for a second about this Alamo Bowl game. Colorado, the opponent, and Kyle, we found out this week a little bit of revolving door at Colorado with the success that the Buffs have had, biggest turnaround this season. We see Mike McIntyre getting tons of these national awards. Now Jim Leavitt, their defensive coordinator, has been hired away. Do we have a sense yet? Have we heard yet how that could impact Colorado with this Alamo Bowl?
Because it's happened so recently here, I don't know that it's been set in stone yet what Leavitt's plan is going to be for the bowl game, whether or not he's going to be on the sidelines, whether or not he'll be out there in Eugene already. But as Mike Gundy sort of referenced on Thursday in his press conference, this late in the year with such a senior-laden defense, the one thing about the CU defense that makes them so good, so many seniors and juniors in starting roles. These guys sort of know the drill. They've played all year under Levitt, who's known as this extremely fiery coach, had a long coaching tenure at South Florida, got hired by the former South Florida coach, Willie Taggart, out at Oregon, bringing those two together. So I don't know that it's going to be much of a concern in this game about what the leadership is going to be, just because they already have it on the field so much. But, this is really going to be, I think, the matchup that we examine most, this OSU spread offense versus this Colorado defense, in an incredible transformation, what they're able to do in just one season. In 2015, they were giving up more than 6.5 yards per play, which was worst among FBS teams, to this year leading the Pac-12 in total defense, second in scoring defense. Just really an impressive strength of a team on the rise.
Yeah, and Barry, this has really been a resurgence for Colorado as a program. I mean, in the Big 12, when they were still a part of the Big 12, I think it was Austin Hayes who I asked him today about, Colorado and what he remembers of Colorado. Said he remembered those days when Colorado and Nebraska were going at it, and I thought, hey, somebody was paying attention when they were younger. But
he's awfully young to be watching football.
But he's exactly right, because those days weren't that long ago. But when Colorado goes to the Pac-12, which geographically, guys, seems like the right move for them when it comes to the recruiting ground that they were going towards, it was more West Coast anyway, but yet they fall away for years, Barry, really kind of went into oblivion. But the return, it sort of feels good as a longtime Big 8, Big 12 watcher that Colorado's back on this ground.
Colorado fell off the college football map as much as anybody I've ever seen. I sometimes had a hard time remembering when I'd list the Pac-12 schools, mentally, I'd sometimes have a hard time remembering Colorado.
Yeah.
It's just a case of the Buffs were great under Bill McCartney in the 90s. In the 2000s, Colorado went to 4 of 5 Big 12 title games, 01 through 05. But they ran into trouble starting in 06, limped through the end of the Big 12 era, and were just awful in the Pac-12 era, and we've literally not seen anything out of them for 10 years. And now they're back. It is sort of heartwarming. You get to see games at Folsom Field, which is a cool setting. I got to go to a lot of games there, and I think, man, what a cool place. Saw the Washington State, the Utah games on television there. Lots of fans back. It is a feel-good story. The question is, can Colorado sustain it in a very competitive league? Pac-12, very, very balanced. Lots of competitive teams. You've got national contenders like Southern Cal and Washington, but you've also you don't have a lot of dogs in the Pac-12. So it's going to be tough to continue to win 9-10 games a year. But Mike McIntyre's done a great job. It's been done before. Maybe Colorado can keep doing it.
Kyle, in the Pac-12, you don't see a lot of teams built around defense. Is that the thing that sets Colorado apart? Obviously, the Jim Leavitt departure, we don't know moving forward exactly what that's going to look like, but they really have had their resurgence built around a great defense. Does that potentially separate them moving forward?
I think it could be part of their identity if they want to continue to be contenders in not only the Pac-12 South, but to win the conference title like they were this year following the Washington. But yeah, talking with a guy like Glenn Spencer, he loves it. The fact that a defensive coach is having so much success in a league that's really known for its offense. Mike McIntyre was the defensive coordinator at Duke before his eventual rise at San Jose State and then heading over to Colorado. But yeah, like I mentioned before, because there's so many seniors on this defense, it's really a reason why it's such a strength. And the fact that CU gave Mike McIntyre more than 3 seasons to get this thing going, which seems to really go against the norm in college football these days. They're able to develop their talent and use that recruiting base, like Barry mentioned, out west, especially in California. Mike Gundy said that was a credit to their staff. He considers, the recruiting ground that OSU is over a lot more fertile than a lot of that California territory. That's a whole different argument, but there is something to be said about a team that's just breaking into the conference, trying to establish its brand, to be able to get the quality of players so quickly within a 4-year span to really get this thing rolling.
Is there any thought that when Colorado looks back on the decision to bolt the Big 12 for the Pac-12, that maybe that I mean, you mentioned at the end, their last years in the Big 12 were not great football years, but maybe that hastened that drop off that they're now having to recover from, or do they look at that and say the move to the Pac-12 was the right thing to do?
Well, I think they look at the Pac-12 move as the right thing to do. Now, competitively, it probably hurt them at the outset because if Colorado stays, Big 12 probably stays a 12-team league, has the North Division. That's a winnable division most years. You got your powers down in the South with the Oklahoma and the Texas schools. In the North, Colorado was fighting Nebraska, some Missouri, probably be going with Kansas State, whoever. Could have won more in the Big 12 North. Long term, though, I talked to Gary Barnett, who coached the Buffs in the late 90s and early 2000s. He said one benefit to going to the Pac-12 is Colorado was way behind in facilities in the Big 12. They got to the Pac-12, they were behind, but they were not as far behind as they were in the Big 12, and it was easier to catch up. He said we would have never caught up in the Big 12. And you think about it. Look at the middle programs in the Big 12, Texas Tech, the Baylors, TCUs, Oklahoma State. Fantastic facilities. Mm-hmm. Colorado and a lot of the Pac-12 does not have those kinds of resources and weren't likely to get them. But Colorado was able to improve their facilities, and now they're competitive within the Pac-12. So probably the best place for Colorado football is the Pac-12.
You know, a lot of fascination about Colorado, and I think people will be happy to know that starting next week, Kyle will be out in Colorado reporting on the Buffs, reporting on their resurgence, bringing a lot of firsthand accounting to you all on News OK and in the Oklahoman. So be sure to check that out as Kyle brings us the story of the Buffs from Boulder as he goes out there to do some reporting. Be sure to stay with the best coverage team anywhere at newsok.com and every day in the Oklahoman.